I discovered my husband had been secretly investing our savings in crypto without telling me, and now we've lost over $15,000. When I look back at the beginning of my marriage, I see a version of myself who is far too trusting. I was in love, and I believed that love meant honesty, transparency, and a shared vision for the future. My husband and I had sat down many times during our engagement and early marriage to talk about money, because both of us came from families where finances had been a source of stress. I grew up watching my parents argue over debt, while he grew up in a household where there was never quite enough money to go around. We both swore we'd do better in our marriage. We promised that we would always be upfront about income, expenses, and savings. It was supposed to be our way of protecting our relationship from the kinds of fights we had witnessed as kids. For the first couple of years, things really did feel stable. We opened a joint account and agreed that a percentage of each paycheck would go straight into savings before we touched anything else. We didn't live extravagantly, but we treated ourselves once in a while. A nice dinner here, a weekend trip there. I felt proud of us because we weren't falling into the trap of overspending. Our savings slowly grew, and I would sometimes log into our account just to admire the numbers creeping upward, imagining how that money could one day go toward a house down payment, or even just the security of knowing we could handle an emergency. What I didn't realize was that while I was admiring that stability, my husband was quietly becoming restless. He always had this streak in him where he wanted more, faster. He would read articles about people who struck it rich on the stock market, or who bought Bitcoin years ago and were now millionaires. He would bring up stories of people who took risks and won big, almost like he was convincing himself that he could be next. I thought it was just daydreaming, like someone fantasizing about winning the lottery. He never said outright that he was investing our money without telling me. The first sign came on an ordinary weekday evening. I had been using our shared laptop to check an online order, and when I finished, I saw an unread email notification pop up. The subject line mentioned crypto portfolio update. I didn't think much of it at first. Spam emails show up all the time. But then I noticed it had his name on it. Curious, I opened it, only to see a screen full of numbers, graphs, and percentages that made no sense to me. It didn't look like a one-off purchase. It looked like an account summary. I remember sitting there for a few minutes, staring at the screen, trying to process what I was looking at. I knew he had dabbled in small investments before, years ago, but he had sworn off it when it didn't work out. So why was he suddenly getting updates again? When I asked him later that night, I tried to sound casual, like I wasn't accusing him of anything. I said something along the lines of, "Hey, I saw an email about crypto. Are you investing again?" His immediate reaction put me on edge. He laughed a little too quickly and said it was nothing, just small amounts, just him playing around. He waved it off like it wasn't important, saying, "Don't worry, it's just a little side thing. I'm not risking anything major." I wanted to believe him, and part of me did. After all, everything looked fine on the surface. The bills were being paid, our savings account hadn't dropped drastically, and we weren't living paycheck to paycheck. But something in his tone unsettled me. It was the way he avoided eye contact, the way he tried to change the subject right after, the way he acted like I was being silly for even bringing it up. My gut told me there was more to the story than he was admitting, but I brushed it aside because I didn't want to start a fight over what might have been nothing. Over the next few weeks, though, I noticed little things that kept gnawing at me. He would spend hours on his phone, scrolling through apps I didn't recognize. He would get notifications late at night, and when I asked about them, he'd say it was just news alerts. Sometimes I'd walk into the room, and he'd quickly minimize whatever was on the screen, acting like I had interrupted something private. It wasn't just about the crypto anymore. It was the secrecy. I kept telling myself not to be paranoid. I reminded myself that he was my husband, that he had promised me honesty, that we had always agreed to be partners in everything. But trust works both ways, and the more I saw, the more I realized that I might not have been given the full truth. At that time, I still didn't know how deep it went. I had no idea how much money was involved, or that it was way more than pocket change. I only knew that something wasn't right, and that the foundation I thought our marriage was built on wasn't as solid as I believed. What I couldn't see then was that the problem wasn't just about money. It was about secrecy, broken promises, and the cracks in our partnership that were about to split wide open. The real breaking point came one Saturday morning when I was going over our monthly budget. I've always been the one who keeps track of bills, due dates, and savings goals. It's not that I don't trust him, but I actually enjoy organizing numbers. It gives me peace of mind. That morning, as I went through our joint account, something felt off. The numbers didn't add up. Our paycheck deposits were normal, and the usual automatic payments for rent, utilities, and credit cards had cleared, but the balance was noticeably lower than it should have been. Not by a few dollars, not even by a couple hundred, but by thousands. At first, I thought maybe I had miscalculated or forgotten about a larger expense, like a yearly insurance premium. But after combing through every transaction, there was no explanation. Several large withdrawals had been made over the past 2 months, each for just under $2,000, and all of them were transferred into an account I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped. I went through each transaction one by one, hoping there was some kind of mistake. But the pattern was too clear. Every 2 weeks, money had quietly disappeared. The account number didn't match anything we had set up together. I knew deep down that it was him. When I asked him about it later that day, I expected at least some sort of explanation. Maybe he was paying off something in installments that I had forgotten about, or maybe there was a joint investment account I had lost track of. Instead, he froze, looked at me like a deer in headlights, and then got angry, really angry. He accused me of snooping and micromanaging him. Like the issue wasn't the missing money, but the fact that I had dared to notice it. I refused to back down. I told him I wasn't stupid, that I could see the withdrawals, and that I had a right to know what was happening with our shared money. After a long, tense silence, he finally admitted it. The account was his crypto exchange wallet. That was the moment the pieces clicked together. The late-night scrolling, the constant notifications, the defensiveness. He hadn't been putting small amounts into crypto. He had been funneling thousands of dollars from our joint savings into high-risk investments without telling me. When I asked him how much in total, he tried to dodge the question, saying things like, "Not that much," and "It's just temporary." But I pushed harder, demanding a number. After what felt like an eternity, he muttered that it was around 25. I thought he meant $2,500 at first. My brain couldn't process anything higher. But when I asked him again to be clear, he looked me in the eye and said it outright, $25,000. I don't even remember my exact reaction in that moment. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. 25,000 wasn't just a little side thing. That was years of careful saving. That was money that could have gone toward buying a home, or building an emergency fund, or investing in something stable. It was more than my entire salary for half a year. And he had gambled it away without a single conversation, without giving me a choice, without even the courtesy of admitting it, until he was cornered. I asked him how he thought this was okay, how he thought hiding it would end well. His response was like a slap in the face. He said, "It's my money too. I don't need your permission to use it." He went on about how crypto was the future, how he was investing for us, and how if I just gave it time, we'd both thank him when we were rich. But I couldn't even hear him. All I could think about was the betrayal. It wasn't just the money. It was the secrecy, the lies, the fact that he looked me in the eye so many times and told me everything was fine while he drained our savings behind my back. That night, I slept in the guest room. I couldn't even look at him. The number kept replaying in my head, 25,000. 25,000 we didn't have anymore. 25,000 I never agreed to risk. 25,000 reasons why the man I thought I could trust suddenly felt like a stranger. The days after I confronted him didn't feel real. It was like I was walking through my own life, but everything was tilted, slightly off. I'd wake up in the morning, make coffee, and watch him scroll through his phone with that same blank, hyper-focused expression he always had when he was buried in charts or reading some crypto forum. I wanted to scream every time I looked at him because I kept thinking about the $15,000 that had vanished. Money we had worked hard for, money that was supposed to be for both of us, not his secret gamble. When I tried to bring it up calmly, it always turned into a fight. He would talk over me, throwing around phrases he'd picked up online like market correction or long-term gains, as if that excused the fact that he had lied. I wasn't arguing about the market. I was arguing about trust. But he refused to see it that way. He kept reframing the conversation, twisting it back to how I didn't believe in him, or how I was limiting our future. And every time he said things like that, I felt smaller, like my very real fears and feelings were being erased. At one point, I remember sitting across the kitchen table from him. He had his laptop open, and there were rows of red and green numbers flashing across the screen. I asked him, "Do you even realize what you've done to us? This isn't just about money. It's about honesty. It's about the fact that you chose to hide this from me." He didn't even look up from his screen. He just sighed and said, "You're overreacting. You'll thank me one day." That sentence echoed in my head for hours afterward because it felt like he wasn't just dismissing my feelings, he was erasing them entirely. The silence in the house became unbearable. Meals turned into battles of will, me waiting for him to acknowledge what he'd done, him waiting for me to drop it and pretend everything was fine. I couldn't even sit on the couch next to him anymore without feeling this giant invisible wall between us. It wasn't just the loss of money that hurt. It was the constant awareness that the man I thought was my partner had no problem making life-altering decisions without me. I started noticing other things too. I'd catch him lying about smaller details, like saying he was working late when he was really watching live trading sessions. Once, I overheard him on a phone call with a friend, bragging about how he was all in on a certain coin. Like this was some heroic risk, instead of a reckless gamble. The pride in his voice made me sick. It wasn't just a hobby, it had become an obsession, and yet a small part of me still wanted to salvage things. I kept asking myself whether this was a one-time mistake or a permanent pattern. We had been together for years. We had shared holidays, family gatherings, inside jokes, and quiet nights where everything felt safe and steady. I didn't want to believe that all of that could be undone by one choice. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just one choice. This was the culmination of smaller lies, ignored red flags, and a habit of brushing off my concerns that I had excused for too long. One night, I tried to have one last calm conversation. I sat him down and asked, "If you had just come to me and told me you wanted to invest, we could have made a plan. Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me?" He finally looked me in the eye, and his answer chilled me. He said, "Because you would have said no, and I'm not going to let fear dictate our lives." In that moment, I realized it wasn't just about crypto. It was about respect. He didn't see me as an equal partner. He saw me as an obstacle he had to work around. That night, after he went to bed, I stayed up for hours staring at our joint accounts, running numbers in my head, trying to figure out how much damage had been done and how much more I stood to lose if this continued. For the first time, I started imagining what it would mean to separate my finances from his, and once that thought entered my mind, it didn't leave. After that night, something shifted in me. I stopped trying to argue with him because it was like talking to a brick wall. Every conversation circled back to the same place. He was the visionary, I was the doubter, and in his mind, he was justified in cutting me out of the decision-making process. But instead of yelling or crying, I went quiet. And in that silence, I started planning. The first step was separating my finances. We had always shared a joint checking account where our paychecks went in, and then we'd pay bills, save, and spend from there. At one time, that had felt like a symbol of trust, of unity. Now, it felt like a trap. I couldn't keep funneling money into an account that he saw as his personal casino fund. So one afternoon, during my lunch break at work, I went to the bank. My hands were shaking as I sat with the teller and opened a new checking account in my name only. I set it up so my direct deposit would go straight into that account, starting with my next paycheck. It felt sneaky, but also like the first breath of air I'd had in weeks. When I walked out of that bank, I felt a mix of guilt and relief. Guilt, because I hated that I had to take these precautions against my own husband. Relief, because for the first time, I knew at least part of my income was safe. No matter what happened with his obsession, I would have something set aside that he couldn't touch. The next step was looking at our bigger picture. We had some savings, but that account had been drained significantly by his investments. I pulled up all of our statements, highlighting what was left, and I realized something that made my stomach drop. He had taken more than I thought. It wasn't just $15,000. It was closer to $18,500. I don't know why he lied about the amount, but in hindsight, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised. That discovery lit a fire under me. I started researching financial advisors and even contacted one anonymously, explaining my situation in vague terms. She told me flat out that I needed to protect my assets and that, depending on how our accounts were structured, I might even want to talk to a lawyer. That was terrifying. I never thought I would be in a position where I'd need legal advice to protect myself from my own husband. At home, the atmosphere kept deteriorating. He was practically glued to his laptop and phone, following every market swing like his life depended on it. He'd mutter things under his breath, curse when a price dropped, then get euphoric when it climbed a little. He lived on that emotional roller coaster, and I was just an unwanted passenger. Whenever I tried to talk about normal things, house chores, family plans, even what to cook for dinner, he barely responded. His world had shrunk down to screens and numbers. And when I asked about the future, about how we were going to recover from the money he lost, he brushed me off again. He said things like, "You're looking at it all wrong. It's only a loss if I sell." That line drove me crazy. To him, the money wasn't gone. It was just in play. To me, it was gone, plain and simple. The breaking point of that week came when I suggested we go see a couples counselor. I thought maybe, just maybe, if we had a neutral third party, we could start rebuilding some kind of trust. His reaction? He laughed. He actually laughed in my face and said, "We don't need a stranger telling us what to do. You just need to stop freaking out and let me handle this." That was it for me. That was the moment I realized we weren't just on different pages. We weren't even in the same book anymore. That night, after he went to sleep, I sat on the couch with my laptop. I typed out a long email to a divorce attorney I had found online. I didn't send it yet, but I saved it in drafts. Just seeing the words written out, explaining the situation, asking about my options, made it feel real. It made me realize I might actually be standing on the edge of ending something I thought would last forever. The scariest part wasn't the idea of leaving him, it was the idea of what would happen if I didn't. If I stayed, if I kept letting him gamble away our money and ignore my voice, what would my life look like in 5 years? 10 years? Would I be broke, exhausted, and still invisible in my own marriage? That thought was almost unbearable. And so, I kept moving quietly, one step at a time, building a safety net for myself in case I needed to jump. The days after I drafted that email to the lawyer felt like I was living in two parallel worlds. On the surface, I was still the same wife going about her routine, going to work, coming home, making dinner, and trying to keep the house running. But beneath the surface, I was carrying this heavy, gnawing secret, that I no longer trusted the man I married, and I was quietly preparing for the possibility of leaving him. His behavior only made things worse. I began to notice how much time and energy he poured into this obsession. He wasn't just checking his investments in the morning and evening anymore. He was checking them every hour, sometimes every few minutes. If the market dropped even a little, his mood crashed. If it climbed slightly, he'd strut around the house like a genius. It was exhausting to watch. One night, I came home late after staying at work to finish a project. I walked into the living room and saw him hunched over his laptop, spreadsheets open, eyes glued to the screen. He didn't even notice me walk in. When I finally asked if he'd eaten dinner, he waved his hand dismissively and said, "Not hungry, I'm busy. This is the most important opportunity of my life." That sentence chilled me, not because of the words themselves, but because of how he said them, with complete sincerity, as though everything else in his life, including me, was just background noise. I tried to keep my patience, but the cracks in our daily life were widening. Bills started arriving later than usual. I noticed a past due notice tucked under some papers on the desk. When I confronted him about it, he brushed it off, saying, "It's just a timing thing. Don't worry." But the more I dug, the more I realized he wasn't prioritizing our obligations. Money that should have gone to utilities or the mortgage had been rerouted into his plays, as he called them. One weekend, while he was out running errands, I went through the filing cabinet where we kept our financial documents. My hands were trembling the whole time, but something inside me needed the truth. That's when I found another unpleasant surprise. He had opened a line of credit I didn't even know about. Nothing huge, but it was still several $1,000s. The worst part was seeing a cash advance taken out against it, most likely to feed his investments. When he came home that evening, I confronted him directly. I told him I knew about the credit line, and I demanded an explanation. Instead of apologizing, he became defensive, almost angry. He said things like, "You're blowing this out of proportion," and "This is how people build wealth. You have to take risks." I stood there staring at him and realized this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about honesty, trust, and respect. He hadn't just made mistakes. He had actively chosen to deceive me over and over again because he thought he knew better, and my opinion didn't matter. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep beside him. I lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling, feeling both numb and furious at the same time. My mind kept circling around the same thought. If he could lie so easily about money, what else could he lie about? If I couldn't rely on him to be honest about something as fundamental as our financial foundation, how could I rely on him at all? The next morning, I took another step. I logged into my new personal checking account and moved a small chunk of money from our joint account into it. Not a huge amount, just enough to cover my personal expenses for a while if I needed to leave suddenly. My heart was pounding the whole time, but once it was done, I felt a strange kind of calm. It was like building a lifeboat while still standing on the sinking ship. Meanwhile, he acted as if everything was fine. He was cheerful, even affectionate, like nothing was wrong, and that scared me even more, because it showed me how easy it was for him to slip into denial and pretend nothing had happened. In those days, I felt lonelier than I ever had before. I couldn't talk to friends or family because I wasn't ready for the judgment or the questions, so I carried it all silently. But deep down, I knew the silence couldn't last forever. Something was going to break, whether it was me, him, or the marriage itself. The following week was when everything started to unravel in ways that could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just the small cracks anymore. It was real consequences showing up at our doorstep. It began with a letter from the bank. At first, I thought it was just the usual monthly statement, but the bold red print at the top told me otherwise. It was a notice of insufficient funds. Apparently, a payment we had set up for our mortgage had bounced. I stared at the letter for a long time, my stomach sinking deeper with each word. A bounced mortgage payment wasn't something that just happened by accident. We had always made sure our housing costs were covered first. If that payment had failed, it meant something had gone very wrong. When I confronted my husband about it, he barely looked up from his phone. He muttered something about how the funds were tied up temporarily, but everything would be fine in a couple of days. He said it like it was no big deal, like our roof over our heads wasn't on the line. That moment crystallized something for me. He wasn't just being careless. He was actively gambling with our lives, and he truly didn't see it as a problem. I pressed him, asking exactly how much money he had taken out of the account. He finally snapped, slamming his phone down and accusing me of not believing in him. He said I was negative, that I never supported his dreams, and that if I just trusted him, I'd see he was building something for us. His voice was sharp, almost cruel, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt genuinely afraid. Not physically, but emotionally. Afraid of how far he was willing to go to defend his fantasy. That night, after he went to bed, I sat in the kitchen with all the documents spread out in front of me. The bank notices, the credit line statement, our dwindling savings account. I wrote everything down, line by line, until I had a clear picture. The total loss was staggering. It wasn't just the $15,000 anymore. It was more. Between the credit debt, the penalties, and the investments that were now essentially worthless, we were looking at closer to $25,000 gone. I remember staring at that number, trying to make sense of it. $25,000 wasn't just a mistake. It was a year's worth of rent. It was a down payment on a house. It was our safety net for emergencies. And now, it was gone, evaporated into thin air because my husband had been chasing some pipe dream of striking it rich. The next morning, I didn't make him breakfast like I usually did. I didn't even try to start small talk. I just told him, point blank, that I couldn't live like this anymore. His reaction was almost surreal. He laughed. He actually laughed and said I was being dramatic, that everyone has setbacks, and that the market would bounce back. But I wasn't laughing. I told him I had already spoken to a lawyer. His face froze for a second before he started deflecting, trying to make me feel guilty for betraying him. He accused me of going behind his back, as though his secret investments weren't the original betrayal. The audacity of it was unbelievable. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, torn between anger and heartbreak. This wasn't the man I thought I had married. Or maybe it was, and I just hadn't seen it before. Either way, the trust was shattered. I could feel myself slipping further away from him with each passing day, building an invisible wall between us that I wasn't sure could ever come down again. And yet, part of me still hesitated to make the final decision. Leaving would mean unraveling our entire life together. It would mean admitting that I had ignored the warning signs for too long. It would mean starting over, alone. That night, I lay awake again, wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth saving. But the other part of me, the louder part, whispered that the damage was already done, and I was only prolonging the inevitable. There came a point when I couldn't keep living in this endless cycle of arguments, empty reassurances, and broken promises. I had tried everything: conversations, ultimatums, even suggesting counseling, but nothing seemed to break through to him. He was stuck in his own world, and I was slowly realizing that if I didn't take control of my life, he was going to drag me down with him. The wake-up call came when I was reviewing our accounts late one night after he had gone to bed. I logged into the bank app just to check, half hoping maybe he had started putting money back. But instead, I noticed that one of our savings accounts was almost completely drained. I had left that account alone for years, treating it like an emergency fund, something we would never touch unless the situation was dire. But he had taken it too, every last cent. I sat there staring at the screen, feeling this heavy mix of anger, betrayal, and fear. That was supposed to be our safety net, the thing that made me feel secure when everything else in life was uncertain, and he had just wiped it away without even telling me. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I realized this wasn't just a series of mistakes anymore. This was a pattern, and it wasn't going to stop. He wasn't being careless, he was being reckless. And he wasn't protecting me, or us, or even himself. He was chasing a fantasy, and I was paying the price for it. The very next day, I walked into a bank and opened a new account in my name only. I can't explain the flood of emotions I felt sitting there at the desk, while the clerk typed away on her computer. My hands were shaking. I kept wondering if what I was doing was wrong, if maybe I should give him one more chance, if maybe hiding money away made me no better than him. But then I reminded myself, he had already hidden so much from me. This wasn't about betraying him. This was about protecting myself. It was survival. I started small, moving little bits of money whenever I could without him noticing. If I got cash back from groceries, I kept it. If I managed to earn any side income from freelance work, I funneled it straight into that account. It wasn't much, but it was something. Each dollar felt like a brick in the foundation of my escape plan, something solid I could stand on while the rest of my life felt like it was crumbling. At the same time, I started quietly gathering information. I spent late nights reading forums, watching videos, and even scrolling through Reddit threads of people who had been through divorces with financially reckless spouses. Some of their stories were heartbreaking, but they also gave me strength. I saw women and men who had rebuilt their lives after losing everything, who had walked away from marriages where the trust had completely disintegrated. And for the first time, I thought maybe I could be one of them. Meanwhile, at home, my husband was sinking deeper into his obsession. He barely spoke to me, unless it was to brag about some opportunity he had found, or to lash out when I questioned him. Our conversations felt like we were on two entirely different planets. I'd talk about bills, groceries, or even just the idea of having dinner together, and he'd wave me off so he could go back to his laptop. He wasn't my partner anymore. He was a stranger who happened to live under the same roof. One night, I suggested we try couples therapy. I thought maybe, just maybe, a neutral voice could help. He didn't even let me finish my sentence. He scoffed, rolled his eyes, and said therapy was for people who were weak. He told me if I really loved him, I'd stop getting in his way. I remember feeling this cold, hollow emptiness wash over me, like the last spark of hope had just been extinguished. That was the moment I truly understood. He wasn't going to change. No matter how much I pleaded, no matter how much I sacrificed, no matter how much I wanted to believe in the man I had married, he was too far gone into his own fantasy. And if I stayed, I would go down with him. That night, after he fell asleep in front of his laptop, I sat in the bedroom with the door closed. I laid out all of our papers, the bank statements, the letters, the bills. I made copies and put them in a folder, hiding it away where he wouldn't find it. Then, for the first time, I called my lawyer Not just to ask vague questions, but to set up a real meeting. I told her I was ready to talk seriously about my options. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. My heart was heavy, my hands were trembling, and every part of me felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff. But there was also this quiet strength growing inside me. I realized I had been living in fear for so long. Fear of losing him, fear of what would happen if I left, fear of starting over, that I had forgotten what it felt like to take control. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to the faint clicking of his keyboard in the other room, I knew I had crossed an invisible line. I couldn't go back to the way things were. I couldn't pretend anymore. The road ahead was terrifying, but at least it was mine to walk. Walking into that lawyer's office for the first time felt surreal. I had parked my car a block away, and I remember just sitting there for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm my racing heart. My palms were sweaty, and my stomach was in knots. I kept going back and forth in my head, telling myself I didn't need to do this, that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe tomorrow he'd finally snap out of it, and things would get better. But then I'd remember the drained savings account, the unpaid bills, the way he laughed at me when I brought up therapy. Those memories pushed me to open the car door and make the short walk to the office. The receptionist greeted me warmly, but even her smile couldn't calm the storm inside me. When I finally sat down across from the lawyer, I felt exposed, almost like I was admitting to a crime. My voice shook as I explained the situation, how my husband had been hiding debts, draining accounts, and investing recklessly without my knowledge. I told her about the nights I stayed up alone, the stacks of bills I couldn't pay, and the way he dismissed me whenever I tried to talk about our future. I expected her to look at me with pity or judgment, but instead, she simply nodded, taking notes, her expression calm and steady. She explained my options carefully. She told me I had the right to protect myself financially, that I could separate my credit from his, and that in a divorce, judges often took hidden debts and reckless spending into account. She talked about gathering documentation, bank statements, credit reports, emails, and keeping everything organized. Hearing it laid out like that made it real. This wasn't just an endless nightmare with no exit. There were steps I could take, a plan, a way out. But it wasn't easy to hear either, as she went over the logistics of dividing assets and debts, of potentially selling our house, of what it meant to legally separate my life from his. The weight of it all hit me. This wasn't just about money. This was about dismantling everything I had built with him. The marriage, the life we had planned, the man I thought I knew. It all felt like it was slipping through my fingers. When I left the office, I didn't feel triumphant or relieved. I felt numb. I walked back to my car in a daze, like I was moving through molasses. I sat there for a long time before even starting the engine, staring out the windshield at people passing by, their lives seemingly so normal, so uncomplicated. They had no idea I was sitting there, trying to figure out how to end a marriage that once meant everything to me. That night, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I called my older sister, someone I hadn't really confided in about the full extent of what was going on. I had always downplayed it, brushing things off with vague excuses like, "Oh, he's just stressed," or "We're figuring things out." But this time, I broke down completely. I told her everything. Every debt, every lie, every sleepless night I had spent worrying. She listened quietly, and when I was done, there was this long silence. I thought maybe she was judging me, or maybe she was angry I hadn't told her sooner. But then, she said something I'll never forget. She said, "You don't have to keep carrying this alone. You've done more than enough. It's okay to protect yourself now." Hearing those words was like someone had lifted a 100-pound weight off my chest. For the first time, I didn't feel completely alone. For the first time, I believed maybe I wasn't crazy or selfish for wanting out. Over the next few days, I began to quietly prepare. I started pulling together all the paperwork the lawyer had asked me to gather. I made copies of every account statement, every piece of correspondence, every record I could get my hands on. I stashed them in a folder and hid it carefully where he would never look. Every document I added felt like a step toward freedom, even though my heart broke a little more with each one. Meanwhile, at home, nothing changed with him. He was still glued to his laptop, still convinced that his big win was coming any day now, still ignoring the growing stack of unpaid bills on the counter. It was almost eerie, how detached he seemed from reality, how blind he was to the fact that I was pulling further and further away. At night, I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with what-ifs. What if he found out what I was doing? What if he got angry? What if he refused to let me go? But then I'd remind myself of the alternative. What if I stayed? What if I spent the rest of my life cleaning up his messes, sacrificing my own security, my own dreams, for someone who couldn't even respect me enough to tell me the truth? That thought was scarier than any confrontation. By the end of that week, I knew the path I was on. I didn't know exactly when or how, but I knew I was leaving. The paperwork, the secret account, the conversations with my lawyer and sister, they were no longer just what-ifs. They were the foundation of my exit plan. And even though the idea of walking away from him terrified me, there was a small spark of strength burning inside me now. For the first time in years, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I had a future that was mine again. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning. I woke up to the sound of him furiously typing at his laptop, his face lit by the bluish glow of the screen. I could tell immediately from the way his jaw was clenched that he was in one of his moods. I tried to ignore it, to make coffee and go about my morning, but I felt that heavy pit in my stomach again. Something was wrong. When I set the mug down on the counter, I saw a letter tucked under a pile of papers. It had the bold red letters, "Final Notice," splashed across the top. My heart sank as I pulled it closer. It was from the mortgage company. We were 2 months behind. 2 months. I hadn't even known. He'd been intercepting the mail again, hiding things from me. I confronted him right there in the kitchen. My voice cracked as I asked why he hadn't told me, why he thought it was okay to keep hiding something this serious. And instead of apologizing or explaining, he snapped at me. He told me I was overreacting, that his investment was about to pay off any day now, that I needed to stop being negative and start supporting him. That word, support, set me off. I told him I had been supporting him for years, covering bills, working late shifts, selling my own belongings just to keep us afloat. I told him that I had drained my savings, given up vacations, put my own future on hold, all because I believed in him, and in return, he gave me nothing but secrets and lies. He didn't even flinch. He just stared at me, his face hard, and then he said the cruelest thing he's ever said to me. He told me that if I wasn't strong enough to stick by him, then maybe I wasn't the kind of wife he needed. He said I was weak. That word cut deeper than any financial betrayal. Weak. After everything I had done, everything I had sacrificed, he had the nerve to call me weak. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there in silence, my whole body shaking. And in that silence, I realized something. I realized that I had been holding on to the hope that maybe, somehow, he would wake up one day and see what he was doing. That maybe he would apologize, change, fight for us the way I had been fighting all along. But that morning, looking at his face, I knew the truth. He wasn't going to change. Not for me. Not for himself. Not for anyone. I went upstairs without another word. I shut the bedroom door and locked it, my hands trembling as I pulled out the hidden folder where I'd been collecting documents. I sat on the bed and flipped through them. Bank statements, notices, records of transfers I hadn't authorized. It felt like I was holding the entire weight of my marriage in my hands. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister. She had been checking in on me every few days since I first opened up to her. I typed back a short message. "It's time. I can't do this anymore." She called immediately, her voice steady and calm. She told me to come stay with her for a while, that I didn't need to explain everything yet, that I just needed to get out before I broke down completely. I felt tears spilling down my face for the first time in weeks. Not tears of despair this time, but tears of release. I finally had permission, from myself and from someone who loved me, to stop fighting a battle I could never win. That afternoon, while he was glued to his laptop in the living room, I quietly packed a bag. I didn't take much, just clothes for a few days, some toiletries, my important documents, and that folder. Each item I placed in the bag made me feel lighter, like I was shedding years of exhaustion with every zipper and fold. Walking past him, on my way out, was the hardest part. He barely glanced up from his screen, muttering something about how I should pick up groceries on my way back. He didn't even notice the bag slung over my shoulder. He had no idea I wasn't coming back. When I closed the front door behind me, I felt a rush of air in my lungs, like I'd been holding my breath for years and could finally breathe again. I sat in my car in the driveway, gripping the steering wheel the same way I had when I went to see the lawyer. Only this time, it was different. This time, I wasn't paralyzed with fear. I was moving forward. I drove to my sister's house, tears streaming down my face the entire way. They weren't tears of sadness. Not entirely. They were tears of grief, yes, for the marriage I had lost, for the man I thought I knew. But they were also tears of relief. For the first time, I wasn't trapped. For the first time, I wasn't alone. When I pulled into her driveway, she was already standing on the porch, waiting for me. I stepped out of the car, and before I could even say a word, she wrapped me in the kind of hug that made all the walls I had built around myself crumble. And in that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. The days after I left felt surreal. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up to the sound of him tapping on his laptop in the middle of the night, or the constant hum of anxiety in my chest. Instead, I woke up in the guest bedroom at my sister's house, sunlight streaming through the curtains, her dog barking in the yard, the smell of coffee drifting down the hallway. It was the first time in a long time that I felt safe. But safe didn't mean easy. The reality of what I had done hit me in waves. There were mornings I sat on the edge of the bed with my head in my hands, wondering how I had allowed myself to get so lost, how I had put up with the lies for so long. There were nights I lay awake replaying every argument, every broken promise, every red flag I had ignored, because I thought love meant holding on no matter what. The grief was heavy, but it was different from the suffocating despair I had felt at home. This grief was a step toward freedom. My sister was my anchor through those first few weeks. She helped me organize all the documents I had gathered. She went with me to meetings with the lawyer. She sat beside me when I called the mortgage company to explain the situation. She never judged me, never told me I was stupid for staying so long. She just reminded me that I was stronger than I felt, that leaving had taken more courage than anyone realized. The divorce process was brutal. When the papers were served, he called me in a rage, his voice shaking with anger. He accused me of betrayal, of abandonment, of ruining his life. He said I had no right to walk away after everything he had invested for us. But his words no longer had the same hold over me. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply told him that I couldn't live in lies anymore. And then I hung up. It wasn't that simple, of course. There were months of back and forth, negotiations about debt, about the house, about what belonged to who. He tried to fight me on everything. He tried to paint himself as the victim, claiming I had left him when he was on the verge of success. But the documents didn't lie. The bank statements, the foreclosure notices, the hidden accounts, they all spoke louder than his excuses. Through it all, I leaned on my sister, and slowly on myself. I took on extra hours at work, not because I had to cover his mess anymore, but because I wanted to rebuild my own stability. Every paycheck I deposited felt like reclaiming a piece of the independence I had lost. I opened a new savings account in my name only. I sat down with a financial advisor who walked me through how to recover from the debts he had left behind. For the first time, I was making decisions without fear of what he might say or do. There were moments of doubt, of course. Moments when I missed the man I thought he was in the early days. Moments when I longed for the comfort of routine, even if that routine had been poisoned by lies. But then I would remind myself of the morning he called me weak, the moment I realized he would never change. That memory was painful, but it was also my compass, guiding me away from the trap I had been in for so long. Months later, when the divorce was finalized, I sat in the lawyer's office holding the stamped papers in my hands. I expected to feel broken, but instead I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight I had been carrying was gone. I walked out of that office into the crisp air, and it felt like breathing for the first time. Life didn't magically become perfect. I still had debts to pay off, still had scars that would take time to heal, but I was free. I was living with honesty again. I was building a future that belonged to me, not to someone else's delusions. My sister threw me a small dinner that night to celebrate. Just the two of us and a few close friends. We laughed, we cried, we toasted to new beginnings. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what a new chapter could look like. Maybe I would travel. Maybe I would go back to school. Maybe I would just take it one day at a time and enjoy the peace of not walking on eggshells every moment. Looking back now, I don't see myself as weak at all. I see someone who endured more than she ever should have. Someone who fought hard and finally found the strength to walk away. And that strength, that choice to leave, to rebuild, to reclaim my life, was the bravest thing I've ever done.